During the Great Crusade, the Night Lords rose to prominence under the command of their Primarch Konrad Curze, now widely recognized as the Night Haunter. His methods were forged in the darkness of Nostromo and showed themselves to be rather ruthless and unwavering in their dedication to terror tactics. Unlike other legions, the Night Lords held no interest in glory or honor. Instead, they sought out only to impose imperial compliance through sheer and unadulterated terror. Curze's approach to warfare was stark and merciless, a mindset captured in one of their most chilling multi-channel Vox broadcasts during the pacification of Lystrania IV.
We have received your offer of surrender and reject it. We did not come to receive your supplication, but to enact judgment. The time for surrender has long passed. The verdict is writ by your own hands. Now is a time to die.
In the early days of the Great Crusade, Curze studied the doctrines of the Legions Astartes under the mentorship of Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's Children. Though he absorbed the Imperium's strategies rather quickly, he began to shape his legion into a unique, brutal image, one who did not stick to these combat doctrines and strategies. The Night Haunter molded the Night Lords into a force devoid of mercy and restraint, whose methods were as dark as the nightmares he had long endured. Under his command, the Night Lords became synonymous with fear, their power armor adorned with grim, macabre imagery, designed to terrify their enemies before the battle had even begun. Skulls, death masks, and symbols of doom became the standard, amplifying their already rather skilled psychological warfare tactics which Curze had wielded for so long. This proved to be remarkably effective, and in many cases, the mere rumor of the Night Lord's approach was enough to compel a star system to pay overdue imperial tithes and rebellions or purge the ranks of traitors and mutants, if only to avoid their inevitable wrath. Despite their early successes, it soon became clear that the Night Lord's methods were not only brutal but excessive. Their reliance on terror and punishments began to spiral into unchecked and unabashed cruelty, in a reflection of their Primarch's dark outlook on life, which was increasingly becoming more and more morbid, which in turn would push them further and further still. What began as a deliberate strategy to enforce orders swiftly descended into an obsession with fear and domination. The Legion's extreme methods would soon earn them a fearsome reputation, but it also would isolate them from their fellow legionaries. As Curze and the Night Lords advanced in the Crusades, their homeworld Nostromo, left without its dark ruler, would revert to its original lawless ways. The enforced peace Curze had so brutally hefted onto the planet began to crumble, and it would once again become a breeding ground for crime, corruption, and all manner of degeneracy. The decay did more than just undermine Curze's earliest achievements. It tainted the very source of the 8th Legion's recruits. Nostromo now would become a world steeped in lawlessness, as it began to supply not the best and brightest, but the most violent and cruel, bloodthirsty members of its population. The new recruits were in essence a reflection of the growing darkness within the Legion itself. Some argue that this influx of violent recruits was a turning point for the Night Lords, poisoning their ranks and driving them further into madness and cruelty. But this theory fails to acknowledge the deeper influence of Curze's leadership. Though he grew to despise many of his Genesons, seeing them as a reflection of his own internal torment, he would remain their undisputed master. His hatred for what his legion had become did not diminish his control, nor the effectiveness of the terrifying methods they employed. The reunification of the Night Lords with their Primarch, while initially promising, set the Night Lords into an irreversible path towards nihilism and into becoming some of the most vile traitors humanity has ever seen. Their fall from grace, which begun in the shadow of Nostromo's crime-ridden streets, would soon escalate into full-blown rebellion. As the Great Crusade would continue, the Night Lords would become increasingly feared. But now it was not just by their enemies, but by the Imperium itself. As the Great Crusade would continue to progress, the Night Lords would become known as much for their atrocities as for their victories. battle brothers of the Konrad tactical squads, like so many of their kin, charged with heraldry into combat, bringing not just conquest, but terror to every world they touched. Far from curbing their savagery, Konrad Curze's interactions with his legion seemed to push them further and further still, delivering what he called a peace through atrocity to planet after planet. In some cases, such brutality appeared justified or even necessary to break the will of rebellions. However, often there was no clear reason for the excess carnage. Entire populations were annihilated, cities skinned and crucified alive, not out of necessity, but because the Night Lords seemed to now revel in it. They were no longer monsters by design, but rather monsters by choice. This transformation of the Night Lords from enforcers of imperial law to agents of indiscriminate terror reflected Curze's own growing mental instability. His control over his legion and their innate violent behavior began to erode as the horrific visions that plagued him since his youth increased both in clarity and frequency. He would even foresee his own downfall, and with it, the collapse of the Imperium's hopes for his legion. Yet despite the Emperor's clear concerns about Curze's mental state and the escalating atrocities committed by the VIIIth Legion, no decisive action would be taken to rein in their savagery, as was done with other legions. There were words, demands, and potentially even threats, but nothing substantial enough to halt the spiral into darkness that had overtaken the Night Lords. Eventually, their reputation would be a more powerful tool than the weapons they wielded themselves. When rogue planetary governors or rebellious systems learned that the Night Lords were en route, many hastened to restore order or pay overdue tithes, and even eradicate perceived disloyalty. Fear of the Night Lords was indeed justified, as the Night Lords issued exterminatus on entire worlds for even a minor offense, or for a single agent who had gone against imperial compliance. However, the unchecked reign of terror would come at a cost. Over the solar decades, the chain of atrocities committed in the Emperor's name grew ever longer, and winding like a tightening noose around the necks of the Night Lords. The crimes of the Night Lords began to weigh heavily not just on the Imperium, but on Curze himself, as his visions of the inevitable dark future, where his legion would be damned, and his own fate sealed, would cause a feedback loop which would draw him further into madness and would lead into more atrocities. However, the question remains, why did the Emperor allow this to continue? Why did he not intervene more forcefully, like he had done with other Primarchs? It seems history would not leave us with a clear answer. Was Curze's usefulness as a weapon of fear far too valuable to relinquish, even as his soul was inevitably darkened? Or was the Emperor's inaction a form of tactful consent? A belief that the ends did in fact justify the means, that no matter how horrifying the means became, for whatever reason the Night Lords would be allowed to continue their bloody path. By the time Curze finally turned against the Emperor, the chain of atrocities had spiraled into an abyss from which there was no return. Of all the legions, none were more outright feared, none more shrouded in suspicion and darkness than the Night Lords themselves, as no one was surprised of their betrayal, as they were increasingly drawing closer to multiple censures for their crimes. While the massacres they carried out might have been under the banner of the Imperium, they were permitted to continue, but now that they were no longer a part of it, it seems their luck ran out. It is easy to see that the Night Lords had always been destined to fall and become creatures of darkness, whether it was due to being bound by a will of a father who, in his righteousness and foreboding, could never truly control them, or due to their own dark desires. In the end, what else could have been their fate but to return to the night from whence they came? And so, the VIIIth Legion, once the undisputed enforcers of imperial justice, became architects of chaos, led by Primarch who had long foreseen the doom of them all. During the early years of the Great Crusade, the Imperium had expanded far beyond the Sol system, and it would encounter pockets of resistance amongst its newly conquered territories. Many of these rebellions were swiftly crushed, often without public notice. However, some insurgencies did require more than mere suppression. They demanded retribution. One such incident was the castigation of Vinhari, a tale that would go down in history as both a lesson in terror and a warning for those who defied the Imperium and what would be the price of said defiance. This world was a natural fortress, a city enclave built into the walls of immense chasms that had once belonged to the infamous Pan-Pacific Empire, ruled by the tyrant Narthan Doom during the Age of Strife. This region had been one of the last of Doom's strongholds to fall during the Emperor's brutal wars of unification. Yet, under the yoke of imperial rule, the people of Benhari seemed to remain sullen, quietly resentful of their conquerors. However, that silence would soon be broken by the arrival of the Crimson Walkers, a cabal of psychers and gene splicers, along with warlords who had once served the ancient Terran tyrants. These shadowy figures slowly gathered their strength, spreading their influence like a creeping plague across Terra. At the heart of their conspiracy lay Benhari, a city now determined to return to the chaos and brutality of the Age of Strife. When the Emperor became aware of the Crimson Walkers, he initially responded in a rather swift and chilling method. All he spoke were 3 simple words: send the 8th. The 8th Legion, now known as the Night Lords, were not present in great numbers within the Sol system at the time. There were little more than 500 astartes at their disposal. They could never hope to overwhelm the facility, which was fortified not just by millions ready to die for their beliefs, but by the sheer fortifications that had been taken over. But as history would show, the Night Lords would not need to rely on numbers. Their weapons of choice were fear and fear itself. The campaign of terror began with an orbital bombardment that fell upon their stronghold from the night sky. For 6 relentless hours, the city was pounded by explosive fire from far above, shattering fortifications and plunging the populace into chaos. But it was what followed that truly marked the coming of the Night Lords. After the bombardment ceased, the city remained cloaked in artificial darkness, a perpetual twilight that seeped into the very hearts of those below. Soon, a chemical-laden downpour rained from the heavens, further poisoning the air and filling the minds of the city's inhabitants with unremitting terror. From the blackened sky, the 8th Legion descended. Jets of flame erupted as they landed amidst the chaos, their forms emerging from the abyss like shadows of death, clad in fearsome power armor that was adorned with every conceivable symbol of terror. The Night Lords would then sweep through the city, killing indiscriminately. Any who dared cross their paths would be butchered in the most painful and methodical ways imaginable, their screams of horror filling the poisoned air. The Crimson Walkers, desperate to defend their stronghold, unleashed an army of mutant monstrosities, creations of gene splicing and dark experimentation. But even these abominations could not hold back the relentless tides of the 8th. Armed with lightning-sheathed claws and the skills of masters of war, the Night Lords cut through these mutants as though they were nothing but mere prey. The battle was not a contest of strength or strategy. It was merely a display of unrelenting horror, designed to send a message. The castigation of Benhari was more than just a military operation, but it was an act of psychological warfare, a punishment intended to instill fear not only into the hearts of the rebellious, but anyone who might even consider defying the Emperor's will. By the time the 8th Legion had completed this grim task, the city was broken beyond repair, and its populace crushed not under the weight of the Night Lords' overwhelming power, but in the terror they had sowed. And as the Night Lords vanished as suddenly as they had arrived, they left behind a city which would never know rebellion again. They had indeed carried out the Emperor's judgment. The 8th had delivered a message, and that message was that defiance would not be met with mercy, but with the full and terrifying weight of the Imperium's darkest warriors. In another chilling episode, the Night Lords unleashed a virus bomb upon an entire continent. The rationale of this extreme measure was the emergence of a cult, which we now know was being devoted to the pleasure god, Slanesh, on a remote island within the continent itself. The repercussions of this act was rather devastating and immediate. As the bomb ravaged the land and its inhabitants, nothing was left except a toxic wasteland. These incidents would become emblematic of not only the Night Lords' brutal tactics, but of what drew such widespread condemnation from other Space Marine legions. Critics would cite the fact that the temple was not the only thing targeted for utter destruction, and the indiscriminate devastation of the continent as unequivocal evidence that the Night Lords had a rather dangerous propensity for excessive force. However, there were also incidents such as their interactions with the dangerous Xenos menace, known to the higher echelons of the Imperium as the Archheth, or colloquially the Bone Drinkers. These insidious life forms were characterized by their fungoid, predatory, and parasitic nature, as they thrived as sentient entities operating in physically interwoven clusters referred to as blooms. Their grotesque existence was sustained through the organizing and siphoning of vital nutrients from other species, primarily derived from the bone marrow of living creatures, with a seeming particular focus on humans. Devoid of any technological ingenuity, the Bone Drinkers seemed to inhabit the derelict void ships of other species, resorting to predation against isolated colonies of feral worlds, which lacked the means to defend themselves. The Night Lords, not yet officially named but already infamous in their ruthlessness, had originally confronted this alien threat in the early years of the Great Crusade alongside the Luna Wolves, wherein they would execute extermination campaigns believed to have successfully eradicated the Bone Drinkers. However, the cowardice inherent in these Xenos allowed them to evade total destruction, returning to the shadows when cornered. By the year 986 M30, troubling reports began to surface regarding renewed attacks on isolated outposts and shipping lanes within the stellar wastes near Olmec. Evidence would suggest that the remains of the Bone Drinkers had not only survived, but were also growing in numbers and strength at a geometric rate, posing a renewed threat to Imperial interests. The Alpha Legion, recently reunited with their Primarch, was charged with the critical task of eradicating this alien menace before it could proliferate further. However, it seems that they had significantly more difficulties than Curze and Horus's own legions did. Over a harrowing 3-year campaign, the Alpha Legion would engage in a systematic campaign against the Bone Drinkers, employing tactics designed to outmaneuver and annihilate the Bone Drinkers. By the campaign's conclusion, the once feared Xenos were all but extinguished, their existence reduced to merely a dark chapter in the ongoing saga of the Imperium. Another incident which would show why Konrad Curze would be so ready to announce his devotion and siding with Horus Lupercal, the infamous arch-traitor of the Horus Heresy, would be because the Night Lords alongside the Luna Wolves would play a pivotal role, working together and bringing in the world of Daromir into Imperial compliance. The mission, while seemingly straightforward, would show everyone the violent lengths the Imperium would go to in order to secure allegiance from reluctant worlds. Here, as the Night Lords advanced, they would employ terror tactics and would show a brutal efficiency while working with the Luna Wolves. One of the most notorious episodes in their history, in particular during these campaigns, would be against the Shihugal Dominion. This operation was marked by an overwhelming ferocity and the remorseless employment of tactics such as throwing the skinned corpses off of captured enemies into the public, and the eventual complete annihilation of the Shihugal civilization. The sheer scale of destruction on this incident would become a legend throughout the Great Crusade. During the earlier stints of the Great Crusade, the Imperium would enter the Ordani cluster only to be confronted by a rather formidable enemy, the warlord Baltel Garon Tertius. Faced with the overwhelming might of the Imperium, Tertius recognized the futility of his own resistance, choosing the path of survival and surrendering to the Imperium. This pivotal decision would mark a rather complex relationship with the Imperium that would span over 5 decades. During this time, Tenturus rose to further prominence, conquering numerous worlds in the name of the Emperor, cultivating a reputation that had garnered the attention of several influential figures such as Malcador the Sigillite and various Primarchs. However, the tides would soon turn when Tenturus ultimately would turn against the Imperium for his own gain. This act would cause shockwaves to reverberate through the ranks of the Imperium as a whole, as he launched a counter-crusade, seeking to reclaim worlds that were already compliant, in order to expand his own burgeoning empire. In response to this, the Imperium would mobilize their forces, sending in Horus Heresy and his Luna Wolves in order to confront this renegade warlord. The mission was twofold: dismantle his insurrection and deliver a stark warning to any within the Imperium who might look at the man as an example of what they should attempt. Joining the Luna Wolves once more were the Night Lords, but this time the Iron Hands and the Alpha Legion would also have their own contingents joining in their campaign. A rather formidable coalition of forces would be formed, hell-bent on retribution. At the zenith of this campaign, Horus himself, accompanied by a cadre of 50 elite Justarian Terminators, executed a daring teleportation aboard the bridge of Tentris' own flagship. In a swift and brutal confrontation, Horus personally dispatched the unrepentant traitor with his talon, delivering a definitive blow to the rebellion. Following his death, the rebellion would soon fall into disarray, haunted by the terrifying tales of the Imperium's might and the culling of the warlords that had accompanied this traitor's campaigns. The Night Lords in particular seemed to take ruthless delight in their pursuit, systematically decimating every single world within Terrentis' realm. The Iron Hands, alongside elements of the Ordo Reductor, unleashed devastating firepower upon Bastion worlds. Cities that once stood proud were reduced to mere ash and dust, and the very air of the man's homeworld became permanently laden with toxins, as a testament to the thoroughness the Imperium would go through in any response against rebellion. When the castigation of Tentris was finally complete, Horus dispatched the gold-dipped skull of the fallen warlord Dutera, accompanied by a grim warning which was articulated by the messenger: "So perish all traitors." This chilling declaration would become all too ironic in later years. The Night Lords would wind up playing pivotal roles in multiple compliance campaigns. In particular, one of these would be known as Karhagatan, designated 154-6. This joint operation saw the Night Lords allied with the formidable Primarch Vulcan and his Salamander's Legion, alongside the forces of the Mechanicum and the Legio Ignis Titan Legion, along with various regiments of Imperial Army. As the campaign unfolded, tensions would simmer between the two legions, culminating in a confrontation that would leave lasting scars on their brotherhood. During this campaign, the Night Lords adopted a strategy rooted in committing acts of brutality around civilian population centers. In one particularly notorious incident, they systematically slaughtered the inhabitants of an entire city and left their corpses visible, ensuring the compliance of neighboring cities through sheer terror. This singular act drew the ire of Vulcan like no other, as he was deeply disturbed by his brother Konrad Curze's ruthless approach to warfare. When Vulcan confronted Curze regarding the actions of his sons, their exchange would escalate into a brief yet intense skirmish between the two Primarchs. This clash would become emblematic of the growing rift between them, highlighting the stark contrast between the philosophies surrounding warfare and the treatment of civilians. Vulcan, being a champion of honor and protection, found Curze's methods abhorrent, igniting a fire of animosity that would continue to burn long after the campaign's conclusion. Following the successful subjugation, Vulcan took it upon himself to report Curze's conduct to the War Master Horus Heresy and to his brother Primarch Rogel Dorn, the master of the Imperial Fist's Legion. The events on this particular compliance campaign would have far-reaching consequences and profoundly impact Vulcan's fate during and after the catastrophic dropsite massacre on Isfahan V. The events of 972 M30 and 984 M30 would stand as pivotal moments of conflict and foreboding, in particular dealing with the interplay of ambition, power, and tragedy amongst the Primarchs. The Pharynstius extermination remains one rather shrouded in obscurity and conspiracy, in particular parts of it being outright erased from Imperial archives. However, what is known is that a joint operation for Imperial compliance was undertaken between the Night Lords and the Raven Guard. However, other than that, raised questions about the scale of violence and the tactics employed, along with the ultimate fate of all those involved. In contrast, the pacification of the Sherrod system in 984 M30 was rather well recorded, and it showed a chilling escalation of tensions between the Primarchs, along with their legions during this tumultuous era. This campaign saw the Night Lords collaborating with the Emperor's Children and the Imperial Fists in a concerted effort to bring the system into Imperial compliance. However, the operation quickly spiraled into chaos. Due to the unstable emotional state overcome by his violent fists, Fulgrim rushed to the aid of Konrad Curze, who had confided in him of his disturbing visions. Curze foretold his own demise at the hands of the Emperor, and it seems that this deeply impacted Fulgrim, along with the knowledge of the impending deaths of many of the Primarchs in conflict with one another, and the catastrophic fate of his own homeworld of Nostromo, which at this point he believed would be irrevocably destroyed by the Emperor's very light. These ominous revelations troubled Fulgrim rather deeply, prompting him to share them with Rogel Dorn. However, Dorn's reaction was one of outrage, viewing Curze's implications as a grave affront upon the Emperor's honor. The confrontation escalated into violence, culminating in Dorn being found unconscious and grievously injured. A large chunk of flesh had even been torn from his torso. At that moment, Curze loomed over his fallen brother, his pallid form weeping, a haunting image of self-loathing and remorse. The gravity of this action led to his immediate detention and exile to his chambers, while the remaining Primarchs convened. However, the tensions would not dissipate, as hours later, the Council of Primarchs would disband, only to discover that Curze had seemingly vanished, and the honor guard of the Imperial Fists, which had been posted at his door, laid butchered. By the time they had initiated pursuit, the Night Haunter had already slipped away with his legion into the warp, leaving behind a trail of dread and uncertainty. And so the Night Haunter had abandoned the Imperium. The year was 984 M30, and it marked a rather climactic turn in events. This was the destruction of Nostromo, the homeworld of the Night Lord's Legion. This devastating exterminatus action was executed under the very legion that once drew its strength from the planet. Following a series of tragic and violent incidents unfolding during the Great Crusade, including Curze's assault on his brothers, the Night Haunter, who had attacked Rogel Dorn, was now officially seen as a rogue element. In a grim display of both power and despair, the 8th Legion unleashed deadly land strikes upon Nostromo, targeting the planet's unstable core. The precision of these attacks triggered catastrophic seismic activity, which culminated in a wave of destruction that ultimately shattered the planet apart. This horrific act fulfilled Curze's haunting visions of his homeworld's annihilation, as he had foreseen beams of white light raining down from the heavens to obliterate the planet. In the aftermath of the self-inflicted cataclysm, the Emperor would directly summon Curze to Terra in order to confront him regarding his brutal tactics and his actions. However, the Night Haunter, instead of facing retribution, allied himself with the War Master Horus, embracing open rebellion against the Imperium during the Horus Heresy, before he could stand before his father. The catastrophic end of Nostromo not only represented physical destruction of a world, but it also signaled the final relinquishment of honor the Night Lords would ever hold. While many Imperial historians have long heralded the Dropsite Massacre as the first open conflict between the Emperor's Primarchs, it is critical to recognize that there exists a prior incident, that of the grievous attack on Dorn by Curze. This act of violence and the destruction of an Imperial-held world predates the conflicts within the Isvan system and the scouring of Prospero. The mental instability of the Night Haunter, an aspect which the Imperium had rather overwhelmingly overlooked, sat at the heart of the first volley of rebellion from a Primarch. In the climactic aftermath of the destruction of Nostromo, there seems to be divergent accounts of Konrad Curze's subsequent actions, seemingly revealing a rather complex interplay between defiance and disillusionment. One prominent narrative suggests that Konrad and the Night Lord's Legion were summoned back to Terra itself, compelled to justify their actions to the Emperor directly and the esteemed Council of Terra. This confrontation, if true, would prove critical to the Emperor's discontent. When supposedly brought before the Emperor, Curze articulated a defense rooted in his deep-seated conviction that Nostromo, in the Legion's absence, had regressed into a state of violence and criminality, and that he and his Legion felt profoundly embittered by what had been perceived as the Emperor's hypocrisy. Despite the Council's condemnation of their brutality, they saw a stark contradiction in the Emperor's grand vision: a great crusade predicated on the use of military might to forcibly reunite humanity, often against the very wishes of the humans who were being reclaimed. The Night Lords expected an acknowledgement from the Emperor for their actions, believing that their severe measures were a distinct reflection of the mission the Imperium had always assigned them, one that could be characterized as sanctioned terror against any opposition to the Imperium's expansionist agenda. To Curze, the Emperor's very rebukes felt like a betrayal, a condemnation for executing the very strategies that it deemed essential to the Imperium's establishment. Curze's growing resentment would then transform into a belief that the Emperor was unwilling to confront the harsh realities necessitated by his vision of complete human reunification. This sentiment not only deepened the rift between Curze and the Emperor, at least if it truly occurred, but also signaled a pivotal moment within the Night Lord's trajectory into the embrace of Horus's waiting arms. In stark contrast to the previous narratives, an alternative account had emerged regarding Konrad Curze and the Night Lord's Legion following the climactic destruction of Nostromo. Rather than going back to Terra to face judgment, Curze and his forces allegedly vanished into the uncharted regions of the ongoing Great Crusade. This account suggests that news of the silent rebellion led by one of the Emperor's Primarchs never permeated into the wider Imperium. Consequently, no formal writs of condemnation or denunciations would be issued by the Emperor, the Imperial Court, or the Council of Terra, nor punitive fleets dispatched to confront the errant Primarch. Elements of the Night Lords stationed within various expeditionary fleets encountered no repercussions, which lends some weight to this belief, while the Night Hunter himself retreated into the shadows beyond the bounds of known Imperial space, continuing his campaigns of conquest and bloodshed in the Emperor's name. It seems that the leaders of the Imperium, at least in this retelling, valued the overarching unity of the Emperor's crusade across the stars more than the public punishment of a wayward warlord, perhaps even fearing the potential repercussions of provoking a Primarch further still. In lieu of direct confrontation, the Imperium resorted to more subtle measures of punishment. They halted shipments of vital supplies to sectors controlled by the Night Lords, effectively banishing Curze from the very vanguard of the Great Crusade. This strategic isolation aimed to curtail the influence and power of the Night Lords without inciting open conflict with the volatile Primarch. By the early years of the 31st millennium, the Court of Terra deemed this strategy effective and would issue a formal order for the Night Hunter's recall. With this, Curze was granted a position within the Loyalist fleets, which were being assembled to counter the sudden betrayal of Horus Lupercal at Isfahan. This pivot marked a significant turn in the Great Crusades. Hatred is never so sweet and vengeance never so pleasurable than when it is applied to one once loved. This was a Nostroman proverb which had permeated the Legion's beliefs. In the records of Konrad Curze's emergence as a quintessential embodiment of malevolence, his reputation for brutality and sadistic tendencies was rather well established amongst his brothers, long before the onset of the Horus Heresy proper, compounding his infamy with the horrific actions which led to the annihilation of his own homeworld, Nostromo, as well as his violent confrontation with his brother Rogel Dorn. Like several Primarchs, Curze had inherited a fragment of the Emperor's psychic abilities, in particular his precognitive abilities, a rather flawed shard of his vast vision. Whereas the Emperor and Sanguinius could perceive a multitude of potential features and navigate through their consequences and complexities, Curze was seemingly confined to a singular, seemingly linear, harrowing vision, a bleak trajectory riddled with failure and death. This oppressive foresight seemed to have poisoned his mind and led him right into the arms of Horus Lupercal, as the stage was now set for the Horus Heresy. In the chaos of Isstvan V, while the sons of Horus, the World Eaters, the Death Guard, along with the Emperor's children, appeared to falter, an unexpected event would occur. The traitor forces would quickly regain their momentum, mounting a rather effective counteroffensive that would seal the fate of many loyalists. As Horus pressed his attack, he orchestrated a tactical maneuver as he trapped the loyalist astartes between two waves of traitor astartes, resulting in devastating mass casualties. As the black-armored Raven Guard faced a relentless volley from their enemies, Primarch Lorgar commanded his word-bearers to exploit a vulnerability in the Raven Guard's unprotected flanks. In response, Lord Corax, the master of the Raven Guard, charged in headlong into the ranks of the traitorous word-bearers. His form would become a blur of charcoal armor and black blades, cutting through the enemies of the Imperium with a ferocity that seemed to defy belief. Despite the objections of his advisors Corferon and Erebus, Lorgar disregarded their counsel, and propelled by reckless ambition, he himself, one of the weaker Primarchs, sprinted across the churned earth, littered with the bodies of the fallen from his brother's legion, in order to confront Corax. A fight in which victory seemed utterly unattainable, the two Primarchs would clash with relentless intensity. Corax fought with lethal intent, driven by the need of the survival of his legion, while Lorgar, a scholar at heart, struggled to merely endure. In this ferocious exchange, Corax utilized his superior speed, agility, and decades of combat experience to gain the upper hand. Lorgar's inexperience as a warrior would soon become evident, and in a swift motion, Corax impaled him through the stomach, the blades of the Raven Lord emerging from his back. As Corax moved to deliver the fatal blow with one of his other functioning lightning claws, he was interrupted by the sudden intervention of Konrad Curze. Weakened from the fierce battle with Lorgar, Corax seized a fleeting moment of distraction, igniting his jump pack and expending almost the entirety of its precious fuel reserves to escape Curze's grasp, soaring skyward amidst the echoing laughter of the Night Hunter. Meanwhile, tragedy would strike the Iron Hands. Cut off and surrounded, their forces almost utterly annihilated at the hands of their enemy. Even the elite Morlock Terminators were slaughtered, and their Primarch Ferrus Manus met a horrifying end, beheaded by Fulgrim. The Raven Guard and the Salamanders could do little to assist their brothers, as they found themselves in a desperate retreat, suffering severe and heavy losses in the process. Those Thunderhawks and Stormbird gunships that had managed to lift off from Isstvan were far outnumbered by those who had originally landed. Corax, though alive, was severely wounded, while the fate of Vulcan remained rather shrouded in uncertainty for quite some time. As the remaining forces of the Iron Hands arrived at the battlefield, they were met with the grim reality that their fallen brothers had been all but slaughtered, witnessing the deaths of their veterans and their Primarch, while the Salamanders and the Raven Guard had been reduced to a mere shadow of their former glory. And in part, much of this was precipitated by the actions of the Night Hunter. In the tumult of the Horus Heresy, it seems the War Master Horus Lupercal strategically chose to deploy Konrad Curze, along with his 8th Legion, to initiate a campaign of extermination against the Imperium's strongholds, in particular those of Hiroldar and Tharmos, located in the Aegis subsector of the eastern fringes. This brutal offensive was intended to secure Horus's flanks, while simultaneously delaying the Dark Angel's Legion by sacrificing many Night Lords to the meat grinder, keeping the first from reinforcing the Loyalists. What unfolded over nearly 3 standard years was a bitterly contested campaign marked by significant bloodshed and strategic maneuvering. As part of this campaign, the Night Hunter devised a devastatingly cunning plan to sway his brother, Lionel Johnson, to Horus's cause. He positioned a deep void beacon along a partial route of one of the Dark Angel's Outrider vessels, and this beacon was ingeniously set to transmit coordinates in advance, facilitating the potential meeting between Primarchs on the planet Sangulsa. Curze's aim was to psychologically and physically dominate his brother, hoping to manipulate Lionel Johnson into submission, much like he had done to many a world before. This meeting would commence with an atmosphere of civility, as the two Primarchs exchanged pleasantries, each accompanied by two warriors of their respective honor guards. However, apparently, the atmosphere quickly deteriorated when the Night Hunter, unable to restrain his darker impulses, slandered Lionel Johnson. In a flash of fury, the Lion retaliated, striking his former brother. This situation escalated rapidly, erupting into a climactic brawl between the two. During this fray, the Night Hunter, fueled by rage and desire to overpower his brother, found himself strangling the life out of Lionel Johnson. Yet fate intervened as one of the Dark Angel Honor Guard plunged his sword into Curze's back in a desperate act that saved the Lion's life. This would lead to both legions scrambling to send in reinforcements in response to this violent encounter, as the Honor Guard, rather than continuing their fight and potentially risking the deaths of their Primarchs, dragged them from the scene and out of combat as soon as humanly possible. Remarkably, both Curze and Lionel Johnson survived, and they would continue to lead their legions in a fierce contest for dominance over the Aegis sector. In the year 009 M31, the war between the Night Lords and the Dark Angels reached a rather crucial turning point. The Dark Angels, under the command of their Primarch, executed a meticulously planned ambush of the Night Lords' fleet as it traversed the Aegis subsector. This divisive confrontation shattered the backbone of the Night Lords' Legion, leaving Primarch Konrad Curze mortally wounded after facing his brother in combat once again. The assault was characterized by precision and strategic brilliance, which resulted in unbelievable losses for the Night Lords, as dozens of capital ships were utterly and completely destroyed, and approximately 1/4 of their Legion fleet was lost in the onslaught. Despite the magnitude of this defeat, a significant portion of the Night Lords' fleet managed to escape the Dark Angel's wrath, retreating into the darkness of space. As the remnants of the Night Lords sought refuge, the recently recovered Night Hunter led a desperate counteroffensive, orchestrating a boarding action against the Dark Angel's flagship, the Invincible Reason. Accompanied by his first captain, Sevatron, and his elite armamenter Terminators, Curze launched a rather ferocious attack. However, the engagement proved catastrophic, resulting in the deaths of nearly all but a dozen of his Terminator cadre, and the capture of his second-in-command, along with the few remaining survivors. In a twist of fate, Curze himself would manage to elude the Lion's forces, retreating into the very bowels of the mighty capital ship. For months, he would become a specter, haunting the corridors of the Invincible Reason, sowing chaos amongst the mortal crew and slaying a myriad of astartes, all the while using the ship's complex layout to his advantage, as he would successfully evade every hunter-killer teams that were sent by the Lion to capture him, decimating several squads of Dark Angels in the process. The Lion himself, undeterred by the challenges of the Night Hunter, took upon the pursuit of his brother personally. For the next 16 weeks, he would stalk Curze through the vastness of the Invincible Reason, but the Night Hunter proved to be too elusive, slipping through the shadows and remaining just out of reach. Eventually, the surviving members of the Night Lords managed to regroup and to effect their escape, vanishing into the void, leaving behind a tale of treachery, vengeance, and the enduring enmity between these two legions, one that remains to this day. As the Ruin Storm unleashed its unrelenting fury, it would obscure the Astronomicon, rendering warp travel nearly impossible. In this chaotic landscape, the Imperium found itself effectively severed. The Dark Angels, realizing their predicament, that they could not return to Terra and aid in its defense, even with the T'Challa engine, would be left in a rather tough bind. Amidst the turmoil, it seemed a glimmer of hope emerged, as the Dark Angels managed to lock onto a beacon of an extraordinary alien device known as a Pharos. Located within the world of Sotha, this beacon guided the First Legion's fleet safely through the warp and directly to the realm of Ultramar and its capital world of Macragge. Upon their arrival, they were met by Reboot Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, along with the Great Angel Sanguinius, the esteemed leader of the Blood Angels, who had also been guided by the Pharos. Together, these three Primarchs would play a pivotal role in establishing something known as Imperium Secundus, a new order intended to continue the fight against the traitors and save some modicum of the Emperor's grand vision. In a monumentous declaration, Guilliman would proclaim Sanguinius as the rightful heir to the Emperor, appointing him as the ruler of Imperium Secundus. Lionel Johnson would be then designated as Lord Protector of this nascent empire and placed in command of all military forces, effectively a title that mirrored the War Master. However, the formation of Imperium Secundus would soon be overshadowed by the chaos of Konrad Curze, as he had escaped the Invincible Reason in order to unleash a wave of terror across Macragge, all the while being intent on spreading fear and destruction. His rampage would draw the ire of both Guilliman and L. Johnson, who would confront the cornered Primarch in an attempt to end his threat once and for all. Yet Curze, ever cunning, had set up a trap. Using planted explosives, he collapsed an entire chapel upon the two Primarchs, allowing him to evade capture once again. Their lives hung in the balance until the timely intervention of warsmith Barbara Stantiok of the Iron Warriors, who was in communications with Guilliman during the attack, acted on instinct, reaching through a portal opened by the Ferris itself, pulling both loyalist Primarchs to safety on Sotha, just as the chapel's great weight crashed down. This act not only saved their lives, but also foiled Konrad Curze's expertly laid out plan. Nestled on the fringes of the galaxy, the remote world of Sotha teetered on the brink of the eastern fringe, bordering both the fiefdom of the 500 worlds of Ultramar and the vast expanse of Imperial territory, which was as of then unclaimed by any of the other Primarchs. Beneath the towering Mount Pharos, the Ultramarines uncovered the monumental apparatus crafted by an unknown Xenos species. This arcane structure had served multiple purposes, as it acted as both a beacon and a route finder, while enabling instantaneous communications across unfathomable distances faster than astropathic communication or any other type of communication available, cutting even through the thick turbulence of the ruin storm. In the aftermath of their defeat at the hands of the Dark Angels, the remnants of the Night Lords followed this beacon through the warp, ultimately finding themselves upon Sotha. Over several months, they would conduct the covert surveillance of the Ultramarines, scrutinizing their every movement and uncovering the true nature of the mysterious device known as the Ferris. Emboldened by this intelligence, the Night Lords executed a sudden assault on the lightly defended world. Intent on seizing control of the Ferris, their goal was twofold: to locate their flagship, the Nightfall, and to discover the whereabouts of their elusive Primarch, Konrad Curze. The ensuing battle was rather chaotic. The loyalist Iron Warriors who had defected and were under the command of warsmith Barbara Stantiok faced overwhelming odds against the Night Lords. In a selfless act of bravery, Stantiok resolved to overload the Ferris. This sacrificial decision, made with the intention of rendering the device's potential empathic abilities unusable by the Night Lords, thwarting their plans and denying them critical strategic advantages. However, the ramifications of Stantiok's sacrifice would echo through the corridors of history, though the true extent of its impact on the galaxy would not be realized for another 10 millennia. In this decisive confrontation on Sotha, the clash between the Night Lords and the Loyalists would be the point in history that would assure the doom of many, as this destruction necessitated by the Night Lords' actions led to the Tyranids taking note of the galaxy. So in reality, the Night Lords are largely to blame for the Tyranids' threat to humanity and all sentient races. In the ongoing pursuit of the elusive Night Hunter, Lion L. Johnson and Reboot Guilliman found themselves at an impasse. Their conflicting policies regarding the security of Imperium Secundus created a rather sizable rift between them. Tensions escalated in the wake of self-termination bombings that targeted an astartes convoy, heightening the Lion's resolve to bring this chaos under control. Believing that Curze was hiding within the rebellious Illithium region of Ultramar, the Lion pushed for the use of drastic measures, a massive orbital saturation bombardment aimed at eliminating his brother once and for all. However, resistance arose from both Emperor Sanguinius and Guilliman, who were wary of the collateral damage such an act would incur. Instead of pursuing his original plan, the Lion opted to deploy his legion's dreadwing to flush out Curze and quell the insurgents by any means necessary. The pivotal moment of this confrontation would come during the assault of the city Alma Mons, where the line finally cornered the elusive Primarch of the Night Lords. Their ensuing confrontation was brutal, with each combatant fighting with the full weight of their tragic destinies. Ultimately, the line would emerge victorious, confronting Curze about his betrayal of the Emperor. To this, Curze's chilling response was, "Why not?" which to the line encapsulated his brother's descent into madness. He described a ruthless monster dwelling within his mind, a manifestation of his frayed and fractured psyche that drove him away from all his former loyalties. Despite having Curze at his mercy, the lion hesitated to deliver a finishing blow. Instead, he unleashed a torrent of fury upon his brother, stripping Curze of his backpack and raising him above his head, then bringing him crashing down across his bented knee. An act that shattered Curze's spine and left him paralyzed, for now. With the Night Haunter grievously wounded, the lion presented him before Sanguinius and Guilliman for his trial. During the subsequent triumph, Curze attempted to defend his actions, adamantly refusing to acknowledge any guilt. He posited that each Primarch was designed to fulfill a specific purpose, a role if you will, and that he was merely acting in accordance to his intrinsic nature. Therefore, no crimes had been committed. Seeing as this was failing in a calculated move, Curze further exacerbated the division between Guilliman and the Lion by accusing the latter of secretly ordering a orbital bombardment, a direct contravention of Guilliman's established orders. Enraged by this accusation, the Lion sought to extract vengeance on Curze, but his path was obstructed by the interventions of Sanguinius, who urged restraint, emphasizing the need for justice over revenge. In a moment that would resonate throughout the Horus Heresy, overcome with fury, Guilliman would seize the lion's sword and break it upon his thigh, an act that underscored the deeply fractious nature between the Primarchs. However, Sanguinius, understanding the broader implications of their discord, dismissed the Lord Protector, thereby bringing the triumph to an abrupt end. This decision bore significant weight and would result in the lion's banishment from Imperium Secundus. In the hours that followed, the Dark Angels would withdraw from a crag, with Lionel Johnson consumed by contemplation. Within the chamber of the titula engine, he brooded over his actions throughout the preceding decades, as he grappled with the consequences of his banishment of Luther and the death of Namil, along with other decisions that haunted him. These reflections revealed an inner turmoil simmering beneath his stoic exterior. As preparations for their return to Caliban unfolded, the Lion felt an undeniable pull in the back of the titula's engine's chambers. In a decisive moment, he ordered the ancient teleportation device to teleport him and Hologen, the Deathbringer, and Lieutenant of the Deathwing, back to Macragge. Their arrival was rather dramatic, as Sanguinius was poised to execute Curze at that very moment for his myriad of crimes. Just at that moment, the Lion and his lieutenant materialized directly into the chamber, imploring Sanguinius to halt his execution. The suddenness of their intrusion was met with resistance as troops flooded the room, demanding the Lion's surrender. Yet Lionel Johnson stood firm, articulating the rationale behind his daring act. He explained that Curze possessed an unwavering ability to foresee potential futures through his precognitive visions, which included an ominous prophecy that his own death would come at the hands of an assassin dispatched by the Emperor. The Lion posited that if this were true, it served as proof that the Emperor was alive, a notion that had sparked hope amidst the prevailing despair. Sanguinius, who had been burdened by his own precognitive insights regarding his inevitable demise, would recognize the validity in the Lion's claims, as his own visions had not changed. The interweaving of their forces became apparent as the weight of their choices loomed large over them. When Reboot Guilliman would inquire about Curze's fate, the Lion knelt before his two brothers, in a gesture that signified both humility and resolve. He vowed to take the mantle as Curze's guardian, a promise that would echo throughout the chambers, signifying a sudden shift in responsibility.